So, ena rangatira tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, ko Jay Marlowe toko ingoa. It's great to be here. I want to speak about some work that I've been doing that's been funded through a Rutherford Discovery Fellowship, but also some funding that we got to set up the Center for Asia Pacific Refugee Studies. And particularly just want to recognize the names there with Erazu, Barry, Annie, who's here, Dan, Jessica, and myself that have been working around, have been working in the IDI around understanding what sort of settlement trajectories looks like for refugees. So I think I'm supposed to show this every time I talk about this data, so just a lot of disclaimers, which is probably longer than Barry's disclaimer around health and safety. So, but basically what I'm wanting to do is to talk about the IDI and provide some descriptive kind of longitudinal analysis, and then some cross-sectional modeling as it relates to demographics, mobility, education, employment, and so I'm going to be throwing probably a lot of slides and data at you. But there's actually a number of papers that have been published and also some that are in train. I'm very happy to connect you to some of that stuff. Okay, so what we did is from 1997 to 2020, we identified just under 25,000 working age people from refugee backgrounds. So 16 to 65. And of that, we had just under 11,000 quota refugees, 2,500 family reunification, just over 5,000 convention refugees, and 6,000 asylum seekers. And so if you're not familiar with those terms, what I'm talking about are the quota refugees are the people that are identified by the government as part of their annual quota. At the moment, that's up to 1,500. During this study, it was more around 750 people a year to 1,000. The refugee family support categories, the family reunification pathway. Over the course of this study, that was 300 people. It's now 600. If I just drop down to asylum seekers are people who apply for protection within New Zealand. They seek asylum, and then New Zealand processes that request. And if they're found to have a well-founded fear of persecution, they then become what's called a convention refugee. So there's about, over the period of this study, we had about, on average, about 400 people applying for asylum a year. And of that, just under 200 people who were then given convention refugee status. And as you're going to see, these labels actually matter because people have different access to rights and entitlements, and they actually have different trajectories. So just some descriptive stuff. What we can see is that the asylum and convention groups are largely the same, and the family and quota are very similar. And what we can see in the family and the quota is that they're younger and older. And we can also see that the asylum and convention groups are predominantly male. And why these things matter is that oftentimes our policy settings aren't all that responsive. Oftentimes it sort of ends in this almost as are you a forced migrant or not? Are you a refugee or not? And so just to kind of illustrate that, I did some work in Christchurch following the earthquakes and interviewed about 120 people on their experiences with the earthquakes. And just this is what men are talking about. I don't really need to describe it. You can see the earthquake just sort of right there, but you're probably talking about civic-minded sentiments. If you look at what women are talking about, you can see that, you know, it becomes a much more of a relational-based interaction. And if you look at older community members, you can see that things like the English language, the earthquake become much larger the role of the community. So we can talk about the same thing, an earthquake, but actually how that's experienced and how that's relevant to people's lives can have markedly different implications. So if we're looking at where refugees and asylum seekers are residing, you can see that for asylum seekers, they're predominantly based in Auckland, and that's the same for convention refugees. Quota refugees are the most dispersed, and it's not surprising because quota refugees are the ones that are sent out to the designated resettlement sites, and they're the ones that predominantly sponsor family members. So those two groups largely match. So what we did is we wanted to look at these different settlement sites. There's about 12 settlement sites now where refugees are relocated. So this is mainly for quota refugees, but once you do your 5-week orientation at the Mangere Refugee Resettlement Center in Auckland, you're oftentimes settled or designated to settle in places often where your ethnic community is co-located. So for some reason, Colombian refugees are oftentimes down in Invercargill, based on the equator and then put down in the southern end of New Zealand. But anyway, so you can see that but you can see that these are the different settlement localities. And so we're interested in like, well, they're settled in these places, but where did they go? And what we found was of that cohort, nearly 80% of that cohort had moved at least once. So this is over that 20-year period. About half had moved 3 times or more, with the convention and family categories being the most mobile. With the quota, being the most mobile, with quota refugees the least likely to move. But what we were interested in is we actually kind of hypothesized that we thought, because there's kind of this grand narrative of everyone comes back to Auckland, and is that true? And what we actually found is that it's not actually all that much. Okay, there is a net increase to Auckland, but it's not as large as we had anticipated. And so what this looks like is this is some of the work that Annie really helped to do, was we looked at people that were non-movers and where they were. So you can see the legend around these different regions of Aotearoa, and we compared that to the movers. And what you can largely see in that is that there's not really any major shifts with the asylum group. The convention group, we can see a net positive increase to Auckland. No major shifts for family, but within the quota, who again are the ones that are sent to designated settlement sites, we do see like an urban drift back to Auckland into Christchurch, and people leaving some of the more regional areas like Palmerston North and the rest of the South Island, which is interesting because there has been, really since 2010, a general shift away from settling people in some of these urban sites where housing is more expensive and those sorts of things. But what we're seeing is some people now moving back to those places. So we're looking at all those places. We're like, okay, well, within these regions, how does that relate to where they are in those regions? And so what we used was the New Zealand Index of Multiple Deprivation, which is based across 7 different domains and about 29 indicators related to employment, income, education, access. You can see all that there. We have a current paper under review in the Urban Policy Review that's looking at this stuff. And a lot of these indicators that they're using are correlated with positive settlement outcomes as opposed to education, employment, health outcomes, and that sort of thing. And so what we did is we looked at at people's first address after either when they first arrived in New Zealand, or for quota refugees after they did that 5-week orientation program where they ended up. And so the New Zealand Index of Deprivation goes from a scale of 1 to 10. I think 1 being high deprivation, or was that low deprivation? And 1 being high deprivation. So we designated 1 to 3 as high deprivation, 4 to 7 as medium deprivation, and then 8, 9, and 10 as low deprivation. And what we can largely see is that particularly for quota refugees, around 65% of quota refugees are settled in areas of high deprivation. And so then we wanted to look at where they were at their last address. So for some people in this cohort, that might be 20 years later. And what you can largely see is very, 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 very little movement. Now, obviously, people might move as individuals across that, but at a population level, what our paper suggests is almost a destiny of deprivation. That where people start out is where they kind of end up. And even in areas of low deprivation, that also seems to be relatively stable. So it really sort of emphasized the importance of a good start. And so thinking about those things, let's look at some of the economic data. And we looked at median income from wages and salaries. And what you can sort of see is what kind of looks like a positive news story. People on upward trajectories are on income. But if you look at that y-axis, if you look at that median income, it's not all that great. And so what we've done, and this is a paper that's about to be submitted likely to the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, is that we then compared that to a cohort of to an age-matched New Zealand population, and also to immigrants in general. And so what you can see is that this right here is a New Zealand population, and this top line here are immigrants. And so what we can see is quite a significant disparity between those two groups. And if I just take the asylum seekers out right here, this dotted line, we just look at convention, quota, and family pathways, this is kind of what it looks like. And so there's a number of studies now that have used predominantly administrative data that have looked at settlement trajectory or economic outcomes of refugees in terms of median income. And what you see in a lot of those countries is actually, whilst disparities still persist, there's actually a catching up, that refugees start to catch up with the general population. What we see in New Zealand is actually a bit of a different story. We actually see almost, in some ways, if we look at the general population, a disparity that continues to widen. And one of the things that we use through the lens of racial capital is that this seems like it's evidence of an exclusionary and discriminatory labor market in New Zealand. We then looked at sort of main source of income from a benefit, and what you can see is, again, it's largely a good news story of people going off the benefit over time, particularly the family group. You see that trend continues. But what we really see is that the steepest drops, with the exception of family maybe perhaps, is in those first 4 to 5 years. That's where you see the best outcomes. And if you look at quota refugees here, after that time period, those things start to actually level out. We then looked at sort of refugees' main source from income, and that also tells a similar story. It's within those first 4 to 5 years, that's where we see some of the greatest shifts, ignoring the asylum seekers here, and that's another story for another time. I'm very happy to speak about that if you have any questions. But again, almost this idea of almost this golden window of investing in investing in those initial years to even sort of that medium term 4 to 5 years is where you very likely get your most bang for your buck. This isn't really surprising, but it's just sort of helpful to see. Speaking English helps in terms of income. And then we wanted to look at this in terms of qualifications that refugees have. And we separated this by males and females. And I mean, this matches the general population that men are earning more than women. But what we can see is that with the university education, this dark bar right here, is that it doesn't start to make a difference in terms of income until after people have been here for over 8 years, both men and women, which suggests it's not only about what you know, but who you know. We then wanted to compare, what does the workforce look like? Does it match what what the New Zealand-born workforce looks like? So this is what immigrants look like, and this is what New Zealand-born look like, drawing on census data. And we looked at those from refugee backgrounds. You can see it's a very different workforce, particularly sort of those in the those that are listed as laborers are more than double the New Zealand workforce. So and then we then looked at what people were earning within these different census, very broad categories. And so refugees are these gray bars here. And so what we can see is that refugees are overrepresented in the lower income brackets and underrepresented in the higher income brackets. And this is even after 20 years. We're not just talking about people who've just arrived. And then we also looked at sort of hours worked per week. And again, this tells a story of refugees largely being relegated to part-time work and less in sort of full-time employment. And so again, what this started to suggest to us is that refugees were also being put often maybe in survival jobs and precarious employment. So yes, refugees are getting jobs, but they may not be scaffolding into careers. And so then we did some cross-sectional modeling. I'm almost done. And what this largely, so this is by these different census categories, and there's lots of stuff going on here. But basically, the refugees are these purple groups here. The circles are females, and the triangles are men. There are some exceptions, but what you can sort of see is that the story that sort of shows that even over time, that refugees are earning less, and that these trends also were the same if we look at this in terms of deprivation and education. And I guess just to conclude, is that Abbas Nazari wrote a book. It was published a few years ago. It was called After the Tampa. He was one of the boys that came. He came as a boy on the Tampa back in the early 2000s. And New Zealand accepted them as refugees when Australia would not. He's now a Fulbright scholar, and he's written this book. And in it, he actually says this. He says that the first generation builds a foundation, the second buys the house, and the third fills it. Yeah. And whilst I think that it's important to recognize that, this data that I'm presenting are first generation refugees. On arrival, they're between ages of 16 to 65. This doesn't tell the story of those that came as children or those that are children that were born of refugees. And my guess is that this would actually tell a much more positive story, and that's really where we're wanting to take the next steps of this study, is to understand those trajectories. For many people, if you were to ask people from refugee backgrounds what is success, they wouldn't talk about success in and of themselves. They talk about it as what's going to be happening for their children in the subsequent generation. So really, for consideration around all this data is, what actually constitutes settlement success? What are the measures and markers that might inform that? We've got a new refugee resettlement strategy that's just being rolled out, and the measures and markers that inform success are currently under development. And that's part of under the refugee resettlement strategy. We've got a refugee survey that's also in development that will hopefully also capture some of these things to give us a better insight into what's going on, because administrative data can only tell us so much, and there's lots of missing data in this. Some of the data is very scratchy. But this has implications for policy, and particularly the importance of those first 5 years. And I think not only does it make sense to provide that investment for refugees, but I think it also makes dollars sense. And just following within all that is actually to have that intersectional responsiveness around gender, age, time resettled, to think about all these things. That's me. I'm very happy to take any questions or comments.
Jay, I'm curious, the older group have you done any modelling or analysis around that older, say 60 plus or 50 plus group, and the impact on them in the first few years?
We haven't done any model. We haven't actually disaggregated that group yet. So that is some work that we can certainly do and look to see what their experience is. I would have some guesses about it, but what we know with those older groups is that they're oftentimes more likely to come through family reunification pathways, and they don't have the language.
Specifically, what are the big gaps in abuse of older people kind of landscape, where we think about those most vulnerable people, and particularly those who don't speak English on arrival in those contexts? So quite an interesting group to look at.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, I was just wondering if any of the admin data or maybe the survey has information about past occupation and past qualifications. You get a sense of the skill gap in some of those occupations.
There's most of the educational qualification data is about this New Zealand specific. Yeah. There is a little bit of information, but it's really scratchy. There's lots of missing data in that, so it's actually really difficult. And I think that's particularly where a survey would be helpful to complement that, and to be able to sort of really be able to clearly show kind of that mismatch between people's skills and qualifications and where they are now.
This one other question was about when you were doing the index of multiple occupation, were you calculating that each year and then matching that on an annual basis to the people? I'm just curious if it was or if it was just a static index for each location.
We used the 2013 index, didn't we?
2013 was the midpoint for our cohort, and so we basically used that as a static measure. But having said that, it would be ideal to do it over time. But comparing 2013 IMD to 2018 and certainly developed 2013, the variance between a particular neighbourhood it doesn't change. Really, there wouldn't be much variability.
Was it this actually? Is it at the exact term or Mishbok?
This is a data zone, so it's bigger. So basically, it's bigger than Mishbok 2. So the Mishbok 2 contains like 100 or 200 people. Data zones can usually up to about 1,000 people.
Any safety?
I was wondering if you're able to look at whether people already had children with them when they came to New Zealand, or whether they had children in New Zealand, and what impact that might have, because we know that has an impact on women's income, and the timing of that might be different for refugees or non-refugees.
So we haven't looked at that in terms of if they had children or if they didn't, but what we have done, and we're looking for funding to do that work, is actually to look at those experiences. So we've identified those 1.5 and those second generation cohorts, and we could also then look at that in relation to those women or those families that had children, and could look at all those trajectories as well. That's where we're wanting to take it. I think it's an important part of the story.
It's just a comment. I thought it would be really interesting when you're doing your comparisons of income from different, like, from like immigrants to people in New Zealand to refugees. Yeah, I think it would be interesting if you split actually the people born in New Zealand into different groups, because like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like all of New Zealand. It's quite a wide.
Yeah, I certainly agree. We could certainly look to do that. I also think even the immigrant group, if we even look through like the Pacific pathway as well, I think that would tell a different story again. So I think that there are opportunities to break that down further for sure. But the paper that we're about to submit, the title of it is "Catching Up or Falling Behind," and the idea is really what it's showing is that even in contrast to most other countries, there's not a catching up, and in fact, there might even be a further falling behind what's happening in this area. Yeah.
Can you look at the data and say how many refugees after they stay in New Zealand, say 10 years, and then they moved out?
Yeah, we are actually really interested to understand kind of where they're going, in particular sort of Australia.
Yeah.
And again, that's something that we think it's hard to identify which countries they're going to from the idea. I don't know if maybe it is possible to identify if they're coming to Australia or something like that, but I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly how many people have left the country from that date. Barry.
I mean, that's really interesting that they're just not catching up in the same way that refugees who go to other countries are. Any thoughts as to what's New Zealand doing wrong? What are other countries doing right?
I mean, I actually think for me as an immigrant, like I'm constantly struck at how much of a network society New Zealand is, about how opportunities are established through kind of these relationships. And to me, I think that what we see, if I went back to slide 7 or something like that, if we look at like where refugees are being settled and everything, I mean, that basically they're being located where the ethnic communities are based, and there's this idea that that's kind of what helps you to get by, but it doesn't necessarily help you get ahead, and that's the power of weak ties. And so I think that things like like the Red Cross's pathway to settlement, the volunteer training program, are really, really important. But the Red Cross has lost some of those contracts, which sort of connects the power of weak ties that connect people to other opportunities. But to me, I mean, a lot of this data actually does sort of show evidence of a discriminatory segmented labor market. So I think about, we have a program like called Pathways to Employment, which is great, and the data actually shows that refugees are getting to work, but not probably into careers. And so it's also thinking about, well, what other policy levers might there be around subsidizing training programs or access? And again, what we can see is if you invest in those early years, it actually seems that people kind of really take off with that. So I think that there could be some additional supports that if that investment was made, it would yield long-term benefits.